Tonight we turn to Genesis 33, and we will cover 33, 34, 35, and 36. That brings us right up to the story of Joseph. Some of the material there will not be much need to comment on, particularly chapter 36, which is just the family tree of Esau. There's not an awful lot has to be said about the family tree of Esau. There are a few things to say, but not much. And so, really, chapters 33, 34, and 35 are all that is realistically we need to expound upon. Last time, Jacob fled from his father-in-law and uncle, Laban. He had fairly impoverished his uncle, inadvertently it seems to me. Some people think that he did it on purpose through stratagems, but as I read the text, it seems like he was just being a faithful herdsman, and God blessed him, and God multiplied the sheep and the goats that were of the coloration that were to be his, and he got rich and Laban got poor. Actually, that's not really cheating Laban, because Laban was poor when Jacob arrived, and he had few flocks, and then under Jacob's care, Laban's flocks had multiplied, and then when Jacob began to work for his own, building his own herds, God just transferred the herds, as it were, over to Jacob. It was never God's intention to bless Jacob in the first place, just to bless Laban, but to bless Jacob. So he left. Laban pursued, and Jacob was clearly under stress about the situation. He traveled hard for 10 days to try to escape Laban. He did not quite get away, but Laban overtook him, and an angel, or God, appeared to Laban in a dream, told him not to hurt Jacob, which tells us something. Jacob didn't have to run so hard after all. You know, he didn't get away anyway, and he was protected by God speaking to Laban. Presumably, Jacob could have gotten a little more rest on the trip, and Laban would have caught up a little earlier, but God still would have spoken to Laban to leave him alone. But Jacob has not yet learned to rest in the Lord, and I don't really mean to be too hard on him. He didn't have a Bible as we do. He didn't really have a relationship with God all those years, really. And I suppose if we were in similar circumstances, we might be under temptation to be terrified as well. But what we can see, nonetheless, is that God was the one guaranteeing his safety, and that he did not have to strive. He did not have to exert himself quite in the nervous and terrified manner that he did. However, once he discovered that he was free from Laban's assault, and Laban left, his next challenge was to face his brother Esau, who was, last he had heard, quite hostile. In fact, threatening to kill him. And so he sent messengers to let Esau know he was coming. Since he figured Esau would find out anyway, he might as well not show himself to be sneaky. And the messenger came back and said, Esau is coming to meet you. And he's got 400 men with him. And that was greatly intimidating to Jacob, since he had no idea what Esau's intentions might be, but the evidence, both from the past and even from the fact that he was bringing 400 men with him, was that he was probably not coming just to say hello. And so that Jacob feared for the lives of his family, and he divided them into two camps. He wrestled with God all night long about this, and that's how he ended chapter 32. He basically got crippled, was brought to the end of his own strength, and renamed Israel, which means a prince with God. The idea seems to be that Jacob finally came to the point where his own strength could not help him. He had a chance against Laban, it may be. He had no chance against Esau and 400 men. So finally Jacob was up against something that his own strength and his own wits could not handle. God had brought this upon him to cripple him, to reduce him, to bring him to the point of crying out to God and begging for a blessing instead of trying to take care of himself by his own strength and his own intelligence and so forth as he had previously. And now, although he limped on his leg, like the Apostle Paul, who had a thorn in the flesh for the same purpose, he was now capable of experiencing God's strength, because in our weakness, God's strength is made perfect. You remember how Paul says in 2 Corinthians that when you may not remember, we haven't studied it here yet, and you may have read it on your own, I assume, some of you have. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant what happened to us when we were in Asia, that we were pressed beyond measure and above strength, so much so that we even despaired of life itself, so that we might not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead. He says God's dealings with Paul as he was in Asia were such as to bring him to a place where he was beyond his own strength. He said above measure, beyond strength. Beyond his own strength. And to the point where his life was hanging by a thread. He says that's where God wanted us, because we were simply unable to help ourselves. We were beyond our own capacity. We were in danger so that we might not be able to trust ourselves, so that we could just trust God. And that's the same passage where he later talks about the thorn in his flesh and how he asked God to take away that thorn. And God said, listen, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. And Paul then begins to rejoice in his infirmities. He says, because when I'm weak, then I'm really strong. And so Jacob had to come to that place too. He was a strong man. And lest he should be overconfident, as he had a tendency to be, because he had much to be confident about. He's a rich man. He had a big family, which was a claim to fame in those days. He was smart. He was on his way back to the land that God had promised his fathers, and that he'd bought the purchase from his older brother for a bowl of soup earlier and so forth. I mean, he had everything going for him. But the thing is, he wasn't trusting in God yet. So God brought him to the end of his own strength, actually permanently crippling him so that he might actually be a real prince with God, and rename him Israel. Now, notice, the man said to him in verse 28 of chapter 32, your name shall no longer be called Jacob. But that is not, strictly speaking, true. He was still called Jacob from time to time. In fact, he's called Jacob in the very beginning of the next chapter. It's just that he would no longer only be known by the name Jacob, he'd also be known by the name Israel. By the way, that is something I should probably point out if I haven't already. That is, there is a figure of speech called a limited negative. It means not only, but also. But sometimes the way it's expressed is simply not this, but that. But the meaning is not only this, but also that. As when Jesus said, for example, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Should be, as understood, the Hebrew limited negative would have that really mean, I didn't come only to bring peace, but also a sword. That's just a figure of speech. Here also, when the angel says, your name will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. More properly, will not any longer be only called Jacob, but also Israel. And so we see him called by both names afterwards. Chapter 33, verse 1, now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming. He could now see the clouds of dust behind the 400 camels that were coming his way in the distance. And he had not had a night's sleep. You remember, he wrestled all night. And it wasn't even just a restless sleep. It was a night of physical exertion. And that came at the end of 20 years of not very much sleep, as he pointed out in his speech to Laban. So here's a guy who's an old man. He hasn't had a good night's sleep for 20 years. He's particularly had a bad night, in the immediately preceding night. He's just been through a stressful encounter with his uncle and father-in-law. In fact, that encounter was stressful for 10 days as he fled, hoping not to be caught up with. He was in terror, for that can drain a guy emotionally, for 10 days fleeing for his life. And now, here comes Esau, and he doesn't know what's coming. All he knows is that he's at the mercy of God, really. Now, he did pray. He did pray previously in chapter 32, and he asked God to deliver him. But after he did that, he resorted to his own bribery by sending enormous amounts of livestock ahead in various droves that Esau would be intended to encounter by increments, so that hopefully Esau's anger, if he were angry, would be diffused by these gifts. Now, someone said to me after the lesson on Tuesday, I forget who I talked to, but you know who you are. I said, well, is it really wrong? Is it really wrong for Jacob to do that? I mean, isn't it right to pray for things and then do, whatever you can too? And of course, if you're out of money and you say, God, please send money, and you have opportunity to get a job, there's nothing wrong with praying and getting a job. That's the normal way to get money. The thing here is that he's trying to buy his brother's friendship, is what he's trying to do. And by giving so much livestock away to Esau, he was transferring that which God had blessed him with to the son that God had not chosen to give such things to. God had rejected Esau. And so he's really transferring some of the blessing of God to another guy just in order to escape the guy's wrath, not because it's the will of God for him to do it or because there's any particularly righteous reason for him to do it, but he's just hoping to diffuse his anger in case God doesn't come through for him. And so he sees Esau coming, and with the 400 men, and he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 maidservants. And he put the maidservants and their children in front, the most vulnerable position, Leah and her children behind that, and Rachel and Joseph last. Benjamin was not yet born. So Rachel and Joseph, they all, of course, had been slaughtered if Esau was angry enough to do it. But he just put the maidservants and their sons in the most vulnerable position in the forefront. Leah and her 6 sons were in the next most vulnerable position, and Rachel and Joseph, Jacob's favorites, were stuck in the back near him, where perhaps they had the best chance of surviving if there was a conflict. And he put let me see here. Then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. This probably was according to the Middle Eastern custom of approaching a certain distance, bowing, coming a little closer, bowing again, and at 7 different stages. Coming, and showing reverence and so forth. The ironic thing about this is that the prophecy given to Rebekah when both these boys were in her womb were, the older shall serve the younger. In other words, Esau shall serve Jacob. But we never see Esau at any time in his story serving Jacob, but we see Jacob bowing down, calling Esau my lord, and so forth, which makes it clear that the prophecy is relevant not to the individuals, but to the nations that came from them, that Edom served Israel. Not that the man Jacob and Esau had that particular relationship to each other. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Which, of course, was, a moment of revelation for Jacob, because he did not know until that very moment whether he would survive this encounter, and it was very clear Esau had no malice at this point. Now, we are not told at any point in the story whether Esau had originally had evil intentions, but God changed his heart through Jacob's praying, or through the gifts, or through whatever. We don't know if Esau came with good intentions initially, and Jacob just feared the worst, but unjustifiably, or whether Esau was really angry at first, and that's why he brought the 400 men, but by the time he got there, God had changed his heart. There's just no way to know. I think, at any rate, whether his heart was changed on the road to meet Jacob, or sometime previous to that, Jacob saw this as the hand of God in Esau's life to have cooled the guy's temper, because he was really angry last time they'd seen each other. And eventually Jacob says, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God, meaning I've seen God's work in your life, to make you smile at me like this instead of try to kill me. And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and children. And he said, whose are these with you? And Jacob said, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the maidservants came near, and they and their children, and bowed down. And Leah also came near with their children, and they bowed down. Now afterward Joseph and Rachel came, and they bowed down. It's maybe the last time Joseph ever had to bow down to anybody. People were all bowing down to him after a while. Then Esau said, what do you mean by all this company which I met? That means all those animals that were sent ahead. And Jacob said, these are to find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. And Jacob said, no, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then receive my present from my hand, inasmuch as I have seen your face as though I had seen the face of God, and you were pleased with me. Please take my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and Esau took it. Now, here again, it looks like Esau's really gracious. I don't care about these things. I have enough. No, keep your gift for yourself. But Jacob presses on him and says, well, okay, I'll take it. Again, you wonder how much of this is that Middle Eastern custom of, you don't say yes the first time, You wait to be asked twice. Like when Abram was negotiating for the cave, Machpelah. Anyway, finally Esau did break down and take the gifts. It was several hundred head of livestock. It was a pretty spendy gift. Then Esau said, let's take our journey. Let us go, and I will go before you. But Jacob said to him, My Lord knows that the children are weak, and the flocks and herds are nursing, that are with me. And if the men should drive them hard one day, all the flock will die. Well, especially in view of the fact they've been driven pretty hard for 10 days previous. Please let my Lord go on ahead before his servant. I will lead on slowly at a pace which the livestock that go before me and the children are able to endure until I come to my Lord in Seir. So Esau said, well, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, now, what need is there for that? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth, built himself a house, and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth, which means booths. Now, this is a strange thing. It would appear that Jacob agreed to go to Mount Seir, the region that Esau was now inhabiting or conquering, and meet Esau there. And Esau said, well, let's go together. Jacob said, no, you go ahead, we'll come along more slowly. Esau said, well, let me leave some people to accompany you just to make sure you're safe. I'm okay here. Go on, send them up. It's very clear that Jacob didn't really want Esau or his representatives with him, though it's not certain why. He may have felt Esau was leading him into a trap. He may have felt like Esau really was trying to disarm him, fatten him with friendship or whatever, and then slaughter him, when he had him at his mercy in his own territory or whatever. But it looks like Jacob never did end up going to Seir. Now, there's also the possibility that he did, and it just skips over that and then tells about his later settling in Succoth. But I mean, that's quite an omission. If the text just leaves out the fact they went to Seir and mentions him settling in Succoth, it is a bit misleading, because the way it reads, it sounds as if he said, I'll meet you in Seir, and when Esau was gone, Jacob never went there. He just settled down somewhere else, and it's not just an encampment. He built booths and everything. It was sort of like a permanent settlement for a while. He later did move from there because of troubles over the incident that we read up in the next chapter. But anyway, it says, Then Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is near Succoth, which is in the land of Canaan. When he came from Paddan Aram, he pitched his tent before the city, and he bought the parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. Now, he pitched his tent on a piece of land that he bought from Hamor, Shechem's father. Shechem was the name of a prince. It was also the name of the city, and Hamor was the king, it would appear. And he had bought this piece of property from them. So this is the second piece of property purchased by the family in the land of Canaan. The first, of course, was that which Abram purchased, Machpelah, which, as far as we know, is the only legally possessed property that Abram's family owned so far until this piece of property was purchased. Now, later on, this piece of property is bequeathed by Jacob to Joseph when he passes on his blessing on his deathbed. Then he erected an altar there called El Elohi Israel. Now, here is a turning point. It's just a short sentence, and it may not seem all that important. I mean, there's a lot of names for God in the Bible. There's a lot of them in Genesis. A lot of altars being made. But this is an important turning point in Jacob's life. Because 20 years earlier, when fleeing from Esau, God had encountered him at Bethel. And he had seen God. He saw the ladder. He woke up startled. He said, God's in this place, and I didn't know this is the very house of God. And that's why he named it Bethel, which means house of God. But he made a covenant with God there. He says, if you will keep me all the days that I'm away from my father's house, and bring me safely back to this land, and provide all my needs and so forth, then you will be my God. And I'll give you 10% of everything, give you a cut of the deal, and I'll also let this rock be your house. Well, as far as the latter two, I don't know whether God valued those two promises very much, but as far as Jacob saying, you will be my God, that is something he promised 20 years earlier, and now for the first time he says so. El Elohi Israel means God, the God of Israel. And Israel, of course, is Jacob's name. So he's saying, God, my God. Jehovah has now officially been owned by Jacob as his own. Previous to that, we see Jacob continually talking about the God of my father Isaac, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, and so forth. He never speaks of him as my God until this time. But this encounter wrestling with the angel, and seen Esau's face and the miracle that seems to have been done in that man's heart as if he saw the face of God, he says, okay, I guess God has kept his promise. I better keep mine. God, you're my God now. You're the God of Israel. I'm Israel. You're the God of Israel. And this would be comparable to his conversion. You know, but before this time, his circumstances were a little like a kid raised in a Christian home. He heard all his life about Abraham's God and Isaac's God, and no doubt he probably believed there was such a God. He had no reason. He was not an atheist. You know, he knew that his father had a relationship with God and his grandfather had a relationship with God. Of course, until he met God at Bethel, he had never had a personal encounter of any kind with God to our knowledge. He was 80 years old at that time. And yet, he had never had a personal encounter at all with God. God, who had appeared many times to Abraham and appeared several times to Isaac, had never, ever appeared to Jacob at that late date in his life. And so he just knew of God by hearsay. Just like a lot of kids raised in Christian homes, they know a lot about God. They probably hear God talked about all the time. Probably grace was said at the table all the time. He was a theist, a believer in God. But his encounter with God at Bethel was, you know, an eye-opener for him, that there really was a God, and that God was really close by, and that's why he woke up so shaken. You know, wow, I mean, there is a God. And yet, he had not yet decided whether he wanted to have the kind of relationship with this God that his father and grandfather had. And many people have this kind of encounter when they know there's a God. They go to Sunday school, their parents maybe believe in God, and they may even have some startling encounters. Places where their life is spared, you know, in a dramatic way, and they say, wow, that must be God. You know, someone up there must like me, you know, I mean, they're living in sin. They're living for themselves. They're trusting in their own strength every day of their life, but they kind of are aware there's a God up there. Someday I'll probably have to commit myself to him. Someday I'll probably have to make a decision about this, but forestalling it. In Jacob's case, he forestalled it for 20 years. But now I figured I got to do the right thing, you know. I mean, I know God is real. I know God is real. I've seen his face. He even named the place Peniel, face of God, where he wrestled with the man. And then he said, I saw the face of God as it were on Esau. He has had an encounter with God. You know, Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4:6, he said, God, who called the light to shine out of darkness, has shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. That is, when we look Jesus in the face, we see the light of the glory of God. And he says that happened to us when God gave us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God. And he compares it with God calling light to shine out of darkness back in Genesis 1. He's talking about our conversion. When you are converted is when God reveals his glory to you in a personal, subjective way. It's like Peter in Caesarea Philippi said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father. Well, why do you say flesh and blood have not revealed it to him? Some years earlier, Peter's brother Andrew had come to him in John chapter 1 and said, we have found him that is of whom the prophet spoke, Jesus the Christ. In other words, a human being did tell him that Jesus was the Christ. But that's different than having it revealed to you. Peter had to discover that for himself by his own encounter with Christ. And his first confession that this was truly something that had been revealed to his own heart was when he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And you said, that's right, God has now revealed that to you, not just flesh and blood. You haven't just learned that from people. Everybody learns it first from people, but they also have to learn it from God. You not only have to be raised in a Christian home knowing the facts of the Christian religion or whatever. I mean, of course you don't have to be raised that way, but even if you are, you still need to have your own personal revelation of God. There has to be your own encounter. You can't live on the coattails of your parents' faith. God doesn't have any grandkids, only children. And so, we read of the people of Samaria when Jesus was talking to the woman at the well. She goes off and tells all her friends, and brings them, and Jesus spends 2 days preaching to the crowd. And at the end of that time, what do they say? They say to the woman, you know, we believe, not because you told us about it, but because we've heard him for ourselves, and we know that this is the Christ that was sent into the world, the Savior of the world, and so forth. I mean, they first came because they kind of believed what the woman said. I mean, they obviously were at least partially convinced. But now that they had their own encounter, they said, now our belief in him, this guy, doesn't depend on what you've told us, but what we now have experienced from our own personal contact with him. That is when conversion, when regeneration takes place, when a personal revelation of God, of Christ, and conviction of sin and so forth, an encounter with God takes place. It's not always actually seen a visible face of God, as Jacob had the opportunity to do, but now he realizes that he can't put off the decision anymore. He's got to acknowledge that God is going to be his God from now on. He makes an altar, and an altar was not only a place, where worship was conducted, it was a monument afterwards. It remained there after he left it behind as a continuing testimony that at this point I have certified that God is my God. And the remaining altar behind was a remaining testimony to that. Baptism, I think, serves a little, to a great extent, that way in the life of the Christian. You can be a Christian without being baptized, though you shouldn't. You should be baptized, as the Bible says to, but what's the value of it? I mean, after all, if faith is what saves you, what's the point of baptism? I think it's like setting up an Ebenezer, setting up an altar, saying, here's something visible. Something invisible has happened inside of me, but now when I go and I feel the water, I bear witness before the people. There's a sensual, not sensual, but sensible experience. Something that the senses can relate to. And the fact that I've gone in the water and there's witnesses of that, it's sort of like setting up an Ebenezer, setting up a altar saying, this is where I declare publicly, and this thing will never change, that I've owned Jesus Christ as my Lord. And so here we have Jacob, probably the experience in his life that would be analogous to a true conversion, though he's far from perfect. But God is his God from now on. Chapter 34. Now Dinah, we were told about her once a long time ago, several chapters ago. There is some reason to believe that Jacob had a number of daughters. We know he had 12 sons, and how many daughters he may have had, we don't know. But this one was named, and the reason she was named is because she is the star of this show in chapter 34. Now, it's hard to know how much time had elapsed. But if this incident in chapter 34 happened only a short time after the events of chapter 33, she could not conceivably have been much more than 7 years old. Now, you might say, well, obviously, she couldn't have been 7 years old. There must be some passage of time here that is not commemorated. Well, possibly so. But there can't be too much. Because the story of Joseph that starts in chapter 37 begins when Joseph is 17. And he was only a few... He was probably born the same year she was. Okay? And there are some other things that happen before the story of Joseph. But, I don't know, the actual years that are accounted for, when he came out of Paddan from the birth of Dinah until he came back to Paddan, she was only probably about 7 years old. Because she was born in the 7th year of the marriage to Leah. Let me see here. Is that how it went? We talked about how that worked out. I may be wrong about the 7 years old, but she couldn't be much. She might have been as much as 13, possibly. I don't know. But she was a very young girl. Anyway, somewhere in that neighborhood there. She's certainly under 17. But her actual age is not given. I'm trying to calculate, but there's not too many indicators around this section of the story of how much time is passing. But she couldn't have been as much as 17, and she probably was no older than about 13 in this story. But anyway, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. That was not a good idea. The daughters of the land were Canaanites. It was bad company, and she should have stayed at home. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, which is a Canaanite tribe, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and slept with her and violated her. Now, we are not told to what degree Dinah approved of this, whether she met him at a party and he took her home and seduced her, or whether he actually raped her. We are not told. The way the story progresses, however, would indicate it was not a case of rape. For one thing, the guy comes and wants to do the honorable thing. He wants to marry her. He's in love with her. He wants to negotiate with her father to see if he can legally marry her. He's already got her at his house. He doesn't ever have to send her back as far as that goes. Probably the people of his land could outnumber Jacob's family as far as doing what they want to do. But we are told a little later that Shechem actually was an honorable man. Of course, sleeping with a woman before you're married to her is not exactly honorable, but you know, the revealed code of ethics was pretty much at a low level in those days. God hadn't said an awful lot outright about such things, and so there was an awful lot of fornication went on in those days that was not unusually corrupt. I mean, it was just Canaanite. It was just Canaanite lifestyle, you know. I mean, centuries later, the Corinthians were like that until Christianity came there. I mean, fornication is just a way of life. Rape was wrong, but I mean, consensual fornication between a couple, that would not be in that society considered to be that dishonorable. And the scripture actually mentions him as being more honorable than his father, than those of his father's house. And so I would suggest that this was not a case of rape, that she probably was, agreed to this. Now, when you realize her family was on the road all the time, and the only guys she ever saw, for the most part, were her brothers, and they were not available for marriage, and she may have been approaching or even have reached, puberty or something. She may have been kind of enamored of the first guy she, got to spend time with outside of her family, and just been seduced or just had no morals herself. It's hard to say, but it says he saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. That can give the impression that, he kind of forcibly did it. But all those things could be true if she was agreeable to it too. And it is a violation of her virginity, even if he talked her into it. At any rate, it made her brothers really mad. But his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. Now, consider the contrast between this and the jerk Amnon, son of David. You remember him? He fell in love with his half-sister, Tamar. And it says his love was so great for him, he was sick with love. And so a friend of his cousin, said, I'll tell you what to do. Fake like you're sick. Ask to have her come in and feed you food. And when no one's around, rape her. And so he said, okay. And so he faked like he was sick and said, oh, please have my sister Tamar come and serve me food. And so she came and prepared the food there. And when she came over to bed, he pulled her into bed and raped her. But the interesting thing is that after he did that, it says, after he had raped her, it says he hated her. And the hatred he had for her was greater than the love he had felt for her before. And it says that he said, get out of here. I don't ever see your face again. And she says, listen, now that you've bothered me, you might as well make it honorable and marry me. He said, I don't want to see your face again. He threw her out of the room. I mean, he didn't have a kind word for her. I mean, the guy was a jerk. But his reaction makes it very clear he didn't have a clean conscience in the deal. He was a rapist, He thought he loved her, but as soon as he raped her, he felt so defiled and so forth, he just kind of probably hated his own, behavior as well. And, he just didn't want to see her because it would remind him too much of his own incontinence and so forth and his own rottenness. Anyway, how different this guy is. This guy has relations with this girl, and afterward, he says, wow, I really love this girl. I want to marry her. And he spoke kindly to her. Just the opposite. Here, he had done a wrong thing too. He violated her. But I don't think he would have had quite this positive after feeling if he had raped her. It seems like there was kind of a positive relationship going between them that it resulted in illicit sex. But it wasn't the kind of thing where Dinah was, a captive. They kept her chained to a bed or something like that. It looks like it was, they kind of wanted to get married. They probably both wanted to at this point. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, get me this young woman as a wife. As it becomes clear a little later, he kept her at home. He kept her at his own house while he went to negotiate about the marriage. He didn't send her home in the meantime. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter. Now, his sons were with the livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until day came. Jacob sounds like he's a lot the same kind of father that David was. when Amnon raped Tamar, it says David heard about it and he was angry. But he didn't do anything about it. He just left it unsettled, and he left it to one of his other sons, Absalom, to take things into his own hands, and he killed Amnon. David was not a real strong father, and Jacob apparently was not either. He hears about it, but he kind of leaves things up to his sons to decide what to do. After all, Absalom was the full brother of Tamar. Amnon was a half-brother, but it was her full brother, Absalom, who took vengeance on the man who had raped her and killed him. Here it was Dinah's full brothers, in this case Simeon and Levi, sons of Leah, like Dinah was a daughter of Leah, who were kind of left to handle this business. Now Jacob should have done something about it, but instead he just waited for his sons to come, and either he wanted to consult with them or let them decide or whatever, but it wasn't a very wise decision. And so Jacob held his peace till they came. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. This is how marriages were arranged. Two fathers would get together. Now Jacob was a powerful chieftain of a nomadic company, and Hamor was the king of a city. So this was a high-level, marriage arrangement between two pretty significant guys trying to link their families. And this kind of thing was done many times for reasons other than love, too. Now, in this case, there was love in the relationship, or at least what they conceived as love, but these kinds of arrangements were often made for non-aggressions pacts to be sealed. That's how Solomon ended up marrying so many people. He married the daughter of Pharaoh, and he married the daughter of that king, and the daughter of that king, and so forth, and that kind of stuff always went on. So as long as there was, intermarriage between these nationalities, it would be unnatural for them to fight wars with each other. When the queen of Israel is the daughter of the king of Egypt, the king of Egypt is not as likely to make war against Israel when his daughter's the queen there, and that's the kind of marriage alliances were very common, and that's a little bit what was going on here too. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved and very angry because he had done this disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. Notice, in Israel. At this point, Israel is just the name of Jacob. But Moses, in writing it, is anticipating the fact that this whole family came to be called Israel eventually. And since it happened to Dinah and she was part of Israel's family, it happened in Israel. By lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them. Worst of it was, of course, Shechem was not circumcised, and that's what had to be remedied first. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us, and give your daughters to us, which makes it seem like there are some other daughters besides Dinah around, and take our daughters to yourselves. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions and for yourselves in it. So it's not just that my son loves your daughter, and let's let them get married. There's that factor, but also, listen, we can have we can both prosper from a friendly relation between our two governments here, and trade agreements and so forth will be to our mutual advantage. Then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me. But give me the young woman as a wife. But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, and spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. And they said to them, well, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition we will consent to you, if you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised. Then give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. Of course, that was not possible in the will of God, and the sons of Leah did not intend to really make good on their promise. They were just deceivers. They were creeps. They were criminals. That's what they were. Con artists. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone. And their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. So the young man did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. That's where it speaks well of Shechem's character there. And Hamor and Shechem, his son. That's interesting. Moses, writing this after the fact, makes a point of speaking very highly of this Canaanite. although Moses was speaking to a generation of Jews who were called to go in and destroy the Canaanites. But under inspiration, he has to say the kinds of things that God once said. And the Old Testament is full of stories like this that show that the Israelites were often more schmucks than the Gentiles that were not chosen by God. I mean, there's a lot of stories like that. Jesus calls attention to some of them. He said there were a lot of Israelite widows starving in the days of Elijah, but God sent him to a Gentile widow because she had faith. There were a lot of lepers in Israel in the days of Elisha, but God didn't heal any of them. He healed a Gentile, Naaman the Syrian. And of course, because it's faith. And what Jesus is basically saying is, you know, the Gentiles sometimes have more faith than the Jews and get more out of God than they do. That's what he said about the centurion, who was a Roman. He said, I haven't seen this kind of faith in all of Israel. And we see that in the Old Testament a great deal here. You know, Moses, writing the story, is definitely trying to paint as good a picture of this guy as he can. That's kind of strange for him to do in view of the fact he's describing Canaanites, the people that he's hoping that the Israelites will go in and destroy. But nonetheless, he's being honest. The guy was more honorable than the household of his father, and we might as well say it, more honorable than the household of Jacob too. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city and spoke with the men of their city. Now this is where official transactions would take place. So the king and his son, the prince, come to talk to the citizenry. Now, it's clear it was not a dictatorship. The king didn't just say, I decree every male should be circumcised. He tries to get their approval. He wants his citizens on his side. So he says, these men are peaceable with us. Well, that was the miscalculation of his life. Thinking that Jacob's family were peaceable men was a fatal miscalculation. They were not peaceable. Therefore, let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for indeed the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised. Now that didn't probably go over real well, so he had to give them a hook. Will not their livestock, their property, every animal of theirs be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us. Now, it's clear that neither Shechem nor his father were motivated by wanting to get Jacob's livestock. We're told very plainly, Shechem loved Dinah. He wanted to marry her. He couldn't live without her. But in order to persuade the men of the city who were not in love with Dinah to agree to cut themselves in this painful manner and to get them on their side, how are you going to talk these guys into that? What, so your son can marry this girl? We're supposed to cut ourselves and mutilate ourselves? Forget it, you know. But so he has to give them some kind of basis. And, you know, look, if they're a pretty rich family, you know. If we, you know, have this intermarriage going on, then our grandkids will be, you know, inheriting all that cattle, you know. And Jacob was clearly the richest guy around, so it was really, you know, there was a financial motivator there for them, and they agreed to it, amazingly. What men won't do for money. Verse 24, and all who went out of the gate of the city heeded Hamor and Shechem his son. Every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. Now, this story, I mean, it's clear by your chuckling that you all have read ahead. You know what happens. It is, you know, it is a story which always brings a chuckle, always brings, you know, sort of a embarrassed, you know, giggle, you know, when you read about this silly thing, you know. But it's one of the saddest stories in the book of Genesis. I mean, here's a bunch of people who in good faith trust the Jews. They trust Jacob's family, and they get wiped out. Even though the Jacob's family promised them that they'd be peaceable, promised them that they could trust them, promised them that they were, you know, would get along, and you know, persuaded these men to actually incapacitate themselves for self-defense, and then just went in and wiped them out in cold blood. I mean, this is one of the worst atrocities in the history of Israel. By the way, the main perpetrators were Simeon and Levi, and we know that later on they were denied the birthright, even though their older brother Reuben lost it by another means. Simeon and Levi, who would have been next in line for it, they lost it because of this incident. It was, however, a small punishment for their deed. They should have been put to death themselves. Now it came to pass on the third day, when the men were still in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. And they killed Hamor in Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house, where she clearly had been remaining until this point, and went out. And the sons of Jacob came upon the slain, plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. A bit of an overreaction. Maybe this is why the law later said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. A guy knocks out your eye, you don't cut off his head. You just take an eye from him. Let's be equal about this. A guy defiles your sister, well, there is certainly something a little more just than wiping out an entire city over it. There must be some kind of recompense. And of course, later in the law, you might recall, in Exodus, the law said if a man who is not engaged and a woman who is not engaged have sex outside of marriage, what they must do to make up for it is get married. So actually, what Hamor and Shechem were proposing here was the proper restitution for the crime. It's what God later said in the law should be the right restitution for this kind of misbehavior. But the law would have absolutely forbidden this kind of disproportionate rage. It says, well, because they defiled their sister, and that's how they answer, They also stole the livestock from Shechem, since there were no men around to complain about that departure of their goods, and their oxen, their donkeys, and what was in the city and what was in the field, and all their wealth, and all their little ones and their wives they took captive, and they plundered even all that was in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, naughty, naughty boys. That's about the extent of it. That's about all he did. He didn't discipline them. He didn't do anything. He just said, that was a very naughty thing. He says, you have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me, and I shall be destroyed, my household nigh. Was that the only objection you can raise to this? That now you're going to be unpopular? Now maybe you'll get killed? Isn't there something fundamentally wrong with what they did, even if there were no repercussions on the family to be feared? Jacob is probably intimidated by his sons. I mean, after all, they're cutthroats, He obviously, they're at that age where you just don't take them over your knee anymore, I guess, And you don't try to make them angry. I think, in all likelihood, this was a failure in his child raising at an earlier point in their lives, so a little late to do anything now, apparently. But they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot? As though that fully justifies what they did. You don't know what he did to our sister, do you? Of course we're going to wipe out every male. What else would you do in a case like this? There's some guys. Now you know why God gave Israel the law later on. So to get some concept of justice, It just wasn't inherent in the family. Okay? Now, then God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. Now Jacob has already recommitted himself to God. He's named God as his own God at the end of chapter 33. But there was another thing too, apparently remained to be done. It doesn't say this explicitly, but it seems to be implied. Remember, Jacob said he'd give 10% of everything to God. It would seem that he had not yet done this. That was the other part of his agreement that he had to keep, and apparently it seemed appropriate to God and to Jacob that this should be done at the same place that Jacob made the promise. After all, that stone was to be God's house. Might as well go to God's house to give him his goods. And so Jacob should go back to Bethel and offer to God 10% of all his livestock. That would be, of course, in the form of animal sacrifices. All of his assets were in the form of livestock, so he'd have to take one out of every 10 animals and sacrifice it there. So it was going to be a huge bloodbath there. I mean, when you figure the guy had thousands and thousands of head, that was going to be a huge sacrificial feast. And yet that was the unfinished business. That was the unkept promise at this point. And God didn't let him go forever without it. God kind of waited to see if he'd do it on his own. But he still kind of settled there in Shechem, and so he didn't seem to be making any fast moves toward Bethel to keep his promises. And so God gives him special revelation. Listen, get up out of here and go to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar there to God who appeared to you. What's an altar for? To offer those animals to me that you're supposed to offer to me. And Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, and change your garments. Imagine that. He knew of people in his household who had foreign gods in their possession. Now he realized he's going to have to go really get things right with God. So let's get those idols out of the house. It's often the case that after a person has come to the Lord, there still are, dark corners of his life that God has to shine the light on, and certain responsibilities that God has to specially put his finger on, and so forth. And that was the case with Jacob. He had to give of his possessions to God. He'd made a pledge. And God said, I expect you to keep it. And so Jacob thought, well, I guess I can't get of it. Now I guess I better get my house cleaned up. Okay, get rid of those false gods. Let's get rid of those things. We can't go meet with God if we got those there. Change your garments, purify yourselves. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in that day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and all their earrings which were in their ears. Apparently that was not considered to be godly. Guys and girls. Anyway, and Jacob hid them under the terror.
We're studying Galatians. We totally reject that for the sake of the gospel.
That's the trouble. That's the problem with having you guys study Galatians the same time we're going through the Torah. How do you study the law and grace at the same time?
I had to say that to me in once. Hey, brother, I just want to tell you, man, and he gave me this verse.
This very verse?
Yeah.
I'd never thought of it this way before. I was joking. It's funny. It just came to my mind for the first time just now. But now I see there's two witnesses. Okay. And they took all those things, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. Now this is what Jacob had feared, was that the cities might pursue him. At the end of the previous chapter, he says, now the Canaanites are going to come after me and going to kill me, and there's a bunch of them and only a few of us, and boy, what'll save us now? Well, the fear of God saved him. Now this is an important thing. By all common sense, these cities would have pursued Jacob. He was the foreigner among their midst. By an act of treachery, an act of war, really, his family had gone in and wiped out an entire Canaanite population. And what would the other Canaanites be expected to do? Hey, this guy is not worth keeping around. Let's go annihilate him. Let's go vindicate our brother Canaanites here in Shechem that he's wiped out. Let's go punish this guy, and who knows, if we let him go, no doubt he'll do it to some of us others. So let's just get rid of him now. And they could easily have outnumbered him, and that's what Jacob expected them to do. Common sense would predict it. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen because God put the fear of God on them. Now, I don't have strong feelings about large or small military or whatever. Back when there was a Soviet threat, which doesn't seem to be a threat anymore. In fact, we don't seem to have anyone threatening us in quite the way the Soviets used to. There was a lot of talk, especially Christians felt, and non-Christians as well, that there needed to be, strong military defense. Republicans especially were strong on this. And since most evangelical Christians are Republicans, it was very common to hear Christians say, what we need is strong defense. Strong defense. The Russians will get us if we don't have strong defense. And I personally, I'm a pacifist, so I think the business of war is the business of governments, not the business of Christians. And the Christians are called to love enemies and to redeem the lost and to bring reconciliation to sinners and lay their lives down for those who would hurt them instead of kill them. And so I just always have figured, and I still do, that Christians don't need to dirty their hands in this kind of business of war. And if the government wants to build big armies or small armies, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's their business. I don't trust in chariots or in horses anyway. But when I tell people I think that Christians shouldn't fight in war, and I don't care if the world fights in war or not, that's, they got enough problems on their conscience. If they want to add that one, that's between them and God, and they'll have to answer for it someday. But that's not my problem. They say, well, what if everyone thought like you? What if everyone became a Christian? What if no one was going to defend the country? Who would defend us then? Well, I don't think that's... Yeah, God would be on our side if everyone was a Christian. I mean, a real Christian. The reason any nation needs a strong defense is because they're not so sure God's on their side. The only time nations are destroyed more is when God decides to judge them. God raises up kings and puts down kings. God's the one who determines the fortunes of war. That is why whenever Israel was on God's side, it didn't matter how big the armies were against him. One angel of the Lord could wipe out all their enemies. 300 men under Gideon could wipe out 30,000 Midianites. It didn't matter. You didn't need a strong defense when God's on your side. You don't need a strong military if God's on your side. But if God's not on your side, you can have the biggest military you want, and God will still crush you. And that was clear, too, at times. That's when the Jews in the days of Joshua went against Ai. Ai was a little city. This is a piece of cake. And they went there and they got beaten back because God had a gripe against them because Achan had a wedge of gold and a Babylonish garment in his tent. And the point here is the defense of a nation depends not on the size of its military, but on whether God is on their side or not. That is why I've always said that Christians do far more for the security of their nation by preaching the gospel, by interceding, by promoting righteousness, than they do by going out and taking up a gun and trying to kill their enemies. Because promoting righteousness is what will promote the national security. Because if the nation's righteous, God won't have any business wanting to judge them. And will defend them against their enemies. And people say, well, what if we totally disarmed the nation then and put all of the money we put in military into feeding the poor or sending missionaries out? Who would defend the nation? Well, I think God could put the fear of God on all the enemies so they don't pursue us. He did it to Jacob here. Jacob was outnumbered. He didn't have a defense against these guys. There was every good reason to expect they'd after him, but they didn't. They didn't come. And why? Because God put the fear of God on them. And they just wouldn't even dream of chasing Jacob. Now, there was a promise made to Israel in Deuteronomy that if they would keep their Sabbaths, and if they would observe, the laws of God, that God would keep their enemies from coveting their land and from coming against them, and so forth. Which, of course, raises serious questions as to whether Israel's right with God now or not, since all their enemies are coveting their land. Obviously, Israel is not right with God, and God's not on their side since they have so many enemies trying to covet their land. But the point is, God is enough defense. And that's pointed out here. It comes out in all the stories of the Old Testament. It certainly is stated in the New Testament that the Christian does not wrestle with flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities and powers. If we do that, there wouldn't be much need to wrestle with flesh and blood in terms of war. And, of course, we probably will never have the time come when everyone is a Christian in any given country anyway, so we'll never be able to test this theory. But it would not worry me at all if everyone in the country was a pacifist because they wanted to please Jesus Christ. Because if Jesus Christ is pleased with them, then He can put the fear of God on our enemies and keep them away. That's what happened here. They journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel. Luz was the previous name, he called it Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him, and he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, which means the God of Bethel. He first named it Bethel, which means the house of God. But now that he knows God, he names the place not after the house of God, but after the God of the house. He renames it from Bethel to El Bethel, God of Bethel, God of the house of God. So he knows something about God now. He knows who he is. And so that's the emphasis he wants to place. Instead of just talking about the house of God, he wants to talk about the God of the house. And so for there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree. So the name of it was called Alon Bakuth, which means the terebinth of weeping. Now, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, where did she come from? This isn't Rachel's nurse or Leah's nurse. This is Rebekah's nurse. That's Jacob's mother's nurse. When did she ever join this crowd? Jacob didn't take her along when he fled from Esau 20 years earlier. And by the way, why is Rebekah's nurse not with Rebekah? We have to read between the lines, but it seems obvious that Jacob has made an unrecorded visit back to his home, to his parents' home. How else would Rebekah's nurse have become attached to his traveling group? He has been in Canaan for a while, and there's every reason to suspect he went back to see his father and his mother. However, it would appear his mother was dead, had no more use for the services of her nurse, and so the nurse decided to, take care of the grandchildren. And so forth, and traveled with Jacob from this point on. But she actually died at this point. She may well have been the same nurse that cared for Jacob when he was a baby. The fact that she died may suggest she was advanced in age, and may have been Rebekah's own, babysitter when Jacob was a little baby, and now decided, since if Rebekah had died, which seems likely at this point, then this nurse had joined the company and died at this point. But we're not told previously about when she joined them, and we're not even told that he had paid a visit home. But it looks like he did. He must have. And if it is correct to read between the lines that Rebekah died, and that's why her nurse was now at liberty to travel with Jacob instead of stay with her matron, it sort of underscores the tragedy of the fruit of the deception that Jacob had perpetrated against his father earlier, because Jacob was close to his mother. And it was for his safety that his mother sent him away. And when she sent him away, she said, "In a few days I'll send for you when it's safe." But he ended up being there 20 years and he never saw her again alive in all likelihood. And all this because he cheated his brother, and because he lied to his father, and because he didn't behave in a righteous manner. His mother, who was the nearest person to him in his family, his father didn't even apparently have much concern for him. But his mother loved him, but he never saw her again. His deception and hers, it was her idea, and he perpetrated it. It separated them probably forever. They probably never saw each other again alive after that. So they got themselves into more. There was a dearer price for them to pay, it may be, than they thought in getting involved in this con. Verse 9, then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Now, it's very possible that we're not being told that this happened there at Bethel. We already know this happened before. There are times when the narrative kind of stops and recaps things and restates things and summarizes things that have gone on before, or in some cases things that have not yet been said. We will find in the story of Joseph there's at least a couple of times when the narrative will say something in summary fashion, and then the following verse will go on to tell the same story that we've just been told, only in more detail. The use of summary statements in the Old Testament is something we're not very accustomed to in our modern literature, but we find it in the Bible. It's probable that we have here just a summary statement of what we've already read, that God had appeared to Jacob when he came back from Paddan Aram. He changed his name from Jacob to Israel. Not as if that was happening at this late date, but we're just being reminded that it happened. In verse 11, also God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. The land which I gave Abraham, Isaac I give to you, and to your descendants after you I give this land. Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with them, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it, and Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him, Bethel. Now, we lose Rachel next. Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, which is another name for Bethlehem, Rachel travailed in childbirth, for she had hard labor. Now it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, that the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, you will have this son also." And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. Most of her children and her maid's children she named with sort of negative connotations. But his father called him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Now, the fact that Rachel was buried near Bethlehem is a fact that is capitalized on later on in the Bible. Actually, in Jeremiah chapter 31, there is a prophecy that is quoted in the New Testament, although it's one of those many places where the New Testament seems to give it a different meaning than you would ordinarily expect it to have. It's Jeremiah 31, verse 15. It says, "Thus says the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children, because they are no more." Now, in the context here, the impression one would get is that this is talking about the fact that the land is emptied of Israelites because the Assyrians have carried them away, and the Babylonians have carried away Judah, and that Rachel's children are no more because the land has been desolate, they've gone into captivity. If you read the whole chapter, the context is with reference to the captivity. But Matthew, of course, sees a secondary meaning in this verse. And it's in Matthew 2, 17 and 18. When Herod slew all the children under 2 years old in Bethlehem, Matthew said, this fulfilled the prophecy of Jeremiah that said this, and he quotes it. You know, there's weeping in Ramah, bitter weeping and travail, or whatever, because Rachel's weeping for her children and they are not. So he applies this prophecy to the tragedy of the death of all those infants in Bethlehem. Now, actually, the infants in Bethlehem were not Rachel's children. Bethlehem was a city of Judah. Judah was Leah's child. Rachel's children were Joseph and Benjamin, and neither, the Bethlehemites were not of the tribes of Joseph or Benjamin. But the reason Rachel is mentioned in this connection is because she happened to be buried near there. It's as if the prophet foresaw this great tragedy in Bethlehem, and Rachel nearby, as it were, turns over in her grave over this terrible thing. They're not her actual children, they're her stepchildren. That's what they are. And, or something, I'm not sure what you call it when there's several wives having children with the same guy, but half stepchildren or something. I don't know what the relationship is technically, but the idea, it's sort of like saying, the founders, the framers of the Constitution would turn over in their grave if they saw the abuses that the Supreme Court is doing today, blah, 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 blah. That kind of expression. She's weeping in her grave because of the nearby tragedy that's going on. Although it's not really her children being slain. Matthew sees this prophecy as being relevant to that. And it's only relevant because Rachel was buried near Bethlehem, where this tragedy took place. And we learn of that, of course, from Genesis 35. Back in Genesis 35, then, verse 21, "Then Israel journeyed and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Edom. And it happened when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel heard about it, but again did nothing." Now, he heard about it. This was an act that later in history, when the law was given, would be punishable by death. Reuben, it's not just that Reuben committed fornication. He slept with one of his father's own wives. Adultery is what we're looking at here, and adultery is punishable by death, and if it was incestuous adultery, all the worse. When that similar thing happened in Corinth, and Paul addressed it, he said, this thing is being tolerated in the church. A man has his father's wife. He said, this is such an atrocity, even the heathen. They don't even do that. Now, if he could say that about the heathens in Corinth, that's saying something, because the heathens in Corinth were very, very well known throughout the empire for their debauchery and for their sexual immorality. And yet they wouldn't even approve of a guy having sex with his father's wife. And yet that's what Reuben did here. Now, Simeon and Levi slaughtered the Schechemites. They seemed to get away with it. Their father rebuked them and nothing more was said. Reuben slept with his concubine, something that should have been punishable with death. But Jacob heard of it, but apparently said nothing and did nothing. Again, Reuben seems to have gotten away with it. And so these three guys, the oldest three sons of Jacob, have all done things that are atrocities. They've all done things that have brought reproach on the name of the family. They've all done things that are just flat immoral and criminal. And yet they seem to get away with it, but they don't fully get away with it. They think they have, just like Esau thought he did. When he sold his birthright, he walked away, and it was years later before he ever regretted it. It seemed like it was a small matter, but later, when he wanted the blessing, he lost it because he had sold the birthright previously. And he later realized that his earlier misconduct, for which he had assumed he'd gotten away with it, was going to cost him something more in the long run. Likewise, these guys found that out to their chagrin later on. When it came time for the patriarchal blessings to be handed out in the 49th chapter of Genesis, Jacob says, well, Reuben, you're not going to excel. You can't have the birthright because you went into my bed and slept with my wife. And he said, Simeon and Levi, you're brothers, partners in cruelty. I don't want anything to do with you. They didn't get the birthright either. And while he didn't punish them or say anything to them at the time, though he probably should have, if he could have, yet it was not forgotten. He carried a grudge against these boys for years thereafter. And they found out that although it seemed to them after their sins that, hey, we got away with it, they really didn't. It cost them forever. Cost them forever. Reuben would have been the ancestor of the Messiah. If he had fallen from that position, Simeon would have been next in line. And if he had fallen, Levi would have been next in line. All three of them were disqualified. Next in line was Judah. And that is why, of course, the birthright, the spiritual birthright, actually went to Judah. Because his three older brothers, all in their own individual ways, disqualified themselves. Now, the sons of Jacob were 12. Now that Benjamin's been born, we can get a full list. And the sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. Now that's not technically true because Benjamin was not born in Paddan Aram. He was born after they came back to Canaan. This is one of those so-called contradictions in the Bible that people have pointed out. However, it's a little picky. 11 of the 12 were born in Paddan Aram, and the author knows that we know, technically one of them was not born in, he just told us one of them was born in Canaan. So, it's not like he's trying to deceive us now. It's very clear. The family grew from 0 to almost its full size in Paddan Aram. True, one of those guys was born later. But, it's, to be picky, it's basically making a general statement, rounding it up. And, of course we know that Benjamin wasn't born there, but that's not some kind of a flaw in the narrators. It's not a neglectful point on his part. Verse 27, then Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre. This probably, again, would be his second visit to his father at Mamre after his return. Or Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abram and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died. and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So we know Esau and Jacob saw each other at least one more time after this. This death of Isaac really is not mentioned in its chronological place, any more than the death of Abraham was mentioned in its chronological place. The death of Abraham was mentioned in its logical place. When the narrator wanted to put Abram out of the picture and start concentrating on Isaac, he just went ahead and reported the death of Abraham in advance, by way of anticipation, because we know that Abram lived well into the adult life of Isaac, and even into he lived to see Jacob and Esau into their teens. But the death of Abram is mentioned previously to that in order to just kind of put him out of the picture. Likewise, Isaac. There's nothing more in the whole book of Genesis to say about Isaac. He didn't really die at this time, chronologically. Some of the things we're about to read happened within Isaac's lifetime. In fact, Joseph being sold into slavery and even the famine that followed happened well within the lifetime of Isaac. If you calculate the years of his life and everything, all the data given in Scripture, Isaac actually lived a long time into the story of Joseph. But the narrator doesn't want to intermix the two. He wants to tell the stories separately, and he doesn't want to interrupt the story of Joseph at the appropriate time. And by the way, Isaac died at this point. He wants to dismiss Isaac from the picture so he can concentrate on Joseph's story, which he begins to do in chapter 37. But before he can do that, there's one other character who has to be dismissed from the picture, and that's Esau, because there's nothing more of significance to say about him. After it mentions that he and Jacob buried Isaac, there's not much more to be said about Esau, except that his descendants did become a significant pain in the neck to Jacob's descendants. They became the Edomites, a hostile tribe, and one that, there were wars and hostilities and so forth between the Edomites and Israelites all the way up until almost the time of Christ. In fact, the last Edomite known to history was Herod the Great, who tried to kill Jesus. Herod the Great is the last known ethnic Edomite. And he was only half Edomite. He was half Jew and half Edomite. But it is said that the Edomites are known from there's not known to have been any Edomites after the Old Testament period. It was pretty much a wiped out group. But they did have a long history in the Old Testament, almost as long as Israel's pre-Christ history, and it was never a positive experience. Now, we're told about Esau's family. We don't need to read this chapter. It is essentially a long list of names, most of which are of little interest to us. It tells us the genealogy of Esau's family. It tells us, first of all, the sons that were born to him while he lived in Canaan. And then it tells the sons that were born to him when he was in Seir. And that's through the first 19 verses. Then at verse 20, it takes a break for several verses to tell us not Esau's family. 20 through 30 tells us about the Horite tribes. Now, the Horites were the people who lived in Mount Seir before Edomites took it over. In fact, the Edomites drove the Horites out of Mount Seir, just like Israel drove the Canaanites out of Canaan. Mount Seir was the region that God gave to Edom, and Edomites dispossessed the Horites. So at this point, we're told something about the Horites, and they were the ones that the Edomites drove out. That's in verses 20 through 30. And then we have the kings of Edom at verse 31, and so forth. Now, then we have what's called the Chiefs of Esau. So the King James, I think, says the Dukes of Esau or something like that. It's not exactly clear what the rank of these people was. But this information would have been relevant to Moses' generation, it may be. But since that time, there's so little known about the Edomites except for their conflicts with Israel that these names, they're probably lost for all time. We only have the sound of their names to know about them. We don't know anything about their personal history. There is, however, if I can find it here, we see in verse 10, these were the names of Esau's sons. Eliphaz. Eliphaz actually was the name of one of Job's counselors. Of course, it was not this Eliphaz, but it was probably an Edomite who had been given a name of one of the Edomite ancestors, one of the great sons of Esau, the founder of the nation. And so it's one of the indicators that Job may have been himself an Edomite. Some of his friends were. There was also a Teman in verse 11. The sons of Eliphaz were Teman, and so forth. One of Job's counselors was a Temanite. In fact, it was Eliphaz the Temanite, which shows that there is some Edomite associations there with Job. Later on, we read of one of the great Edomite guys whose name is Jobab. Right now I'm scanning to see it. I'm using someone else's Bible. I have it marked. 33, thanks. In my own Bible I have it marked, but I'm borrowing Ron's Bible for this because I left mine at home by accident. But yeah, it's verse 33. And when Bela died, Jobab, the son of Zerah of Bozrah, reigned in his place. Jobab could conceivably be another form of the name Job. We are told that Job was the greatest man and the richest man of the kings of the east, or of the east. That's what the book of Job tells us about. We're not told exactly what his nationality was, but since he had a close friend who was a Temanite, and Teman was a grandson of Esau, and since there was a leading Edomite leader named Jobab, which could be another form of the name Job, there is a possibility that we have a reference here to Job and that he was an Edomite, which would indicate that not every Edomite was bad. As far as that goes, Esau didn't turn out to be all that bad in the end. I mean, he seemed like a decent guy. So when we say bad things about Esau or Edomites, not all of them were wicked, or they weren't like the Canaanites who were, as a tribe, cursed, to be wiped out by the Jews. But their family line is here, and most of the names absolutely have no meaning to us, and therefore there's not much reason to comment on them. And so we dismiss Esau from the picture. We've dismissed Isaac and Esau in this short space of time, as well as Deborah, the nurse, and Rachel. And we've lost a lot. And Hamor and Shechem and their friends. I mean, a lot of people died in this section we've studied today. But chapter 37 then begins the story of Joseph. And the story runs unbroken from chapter 37 to the end of the book. It's all about Joseph from here, except for chapter 38. And this is a strange thing, that the author would bother to interrupt the story of Joseph with chapter 38. Chapter 38 tells something about Judah's family. And it's interesting that Moses would have the foresight to interrupt the story of Joseph, or even to include something about Judah's family. He tells us very little, for instance, about the personal history of Reuben's or Simeon's or Gad or Dan or Naphtali's families, but he does single out Judah, probably because he got the birthright. But as later history would show, of course Moses didn't know this, David came from the tribe of Judah, and the Messiah later from David. So the information about Judah's immediate family in chapter 38 becomes relevant to later generations, much later than Moses, who wrote this, as giving us some important information about how Jesus' family developed. And so we will have a chapter coming up on that, on Judah, but other than chapter 38, the rest of the book of Genesis is all the story of Joseph, and one of the finest stories in all of literature, by most reckoning. And that is the end of our study tonight, so we easily were able to cover the material, as I thought, in the time allotted.